Welcome to Dr. Ruscio Radio, providing practical and science-based solutions to feeling your best. To stay up to date on the latest topics, as well as all of our prior episodes, make sure to subscribe in your podcast player. For weekly updates, visit drruscio.com. That's drruscio.com. The following discussion is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first speaking with your doctor. Now, let's head to the show.
Hey everyone, I had back on the podcast today Dr. Titus Chu. He is the author of Brain Save and an integrative and chiropractic neurologist. And this is an area that I think people could really benefit from considering going through an evaluation, especially if they've had any prior head trauma, but perhaps even not that obvious, where a mild trauma may be enough for some people to be thwarting their ability to heal, move forward, have less food reactivity, less reactivity to stress, less reactivity to their environment. And there was a few real pearls here. One was his remark that history is the most important test that he has. And I want to second that and just point to the fact that I, A, agree with that, and B, a large reason why I feel that myself and the doctors at the center are obtaining better results over time is the podcast, the chance to pick the brains of different experts in different areas like neurological health, abdominal and pelvic adhesions, in sleep disordered breathing, and progressively build into our initial paperwork better screening questions to make sure that before you even see the doctor, that they already have a pretty good suspicion with supporting evidence as to whether or not there could be adhesions, sleep disordered breathing, potentially a neurological imbalance. Very, very important. And I just love how he corroborated that, someone's history and what we can glean from a combination of a questionnaire, then cross-referenced, as in our center actually, cross-referenced first by our health coach, and then finally in a visit with the doctor to really make sure that we have the most refined picture of the person put together. We also discussed how there's this spectrum similar to gut health where interventions can be used to help get someone out of a degree of pain, suffering, and reactivity on the one end of the spectrum, and at the other end of the spectrum can be used for better performance and optimization. And that applies to the gut, and perhaps you have less upset from a glass of wine or more tolerance for eating bad food. That's kind of performance. And perhaps the neurological equivalent of that would be a higher tolerance to stress, or a longer ability to focus, as just a few kind of general examples. We discussed some of the available units that are supposed to stimulate parasympathetic or vagal nerve activity. A Zen unit as one, and Apollo Neuro as another. So we did discuss some of those devices. We also discussed a potential vestibular tie-in to exercise intolerance, and more broadly, how Titus is looking at the connection of the brain as it pertains to exercise intolerance. So a few important insights there. And we also discussed how he was able to adapt much of his practice actually to a telehealth model when lockdown went into effect, thus making it even easier for people to acquire a personalized assessment and corresponding neural rehab or optimization plan. So just a great podcast all around. Second time he was on the show. Really enjoy our conversations. And I also want to point you to the clinic if you're in need of help. And happy to say that our clinical team is growing, and all of these conversations actually lead me to reflexively even further tune our paperwork to make sure that vitally important background on an individual is as sharp as it can be, so we really have the most complete picture about the individual as possible, so we can use the least amount of testing, the least amount of dietary changes, the least amount of supplements, and get someone through the confusion and to their goal of feeling better as quickly as possible. So in any case, we will now go to the conversation with Dr. Titus Chu on brain health. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Dr. Ruscio Radio. This is Dr. Ruscio back with Dr. Titus Chu, who wrote a great book that I recommend routinely in the clinic for those who I suspect have some type of post-concussion syndrome or a cortical imbalance, just some bonk on the head that seems to have started around the same time that fatigue or depression or insomnia or IBS started. And he was on the podcast, boy, Titus, a couple of years ago now, I think, discussing that. And we're going to do kind of a part 2, which I'm really excited about, because one of the things that he just mentioned off air was, as we all kind of had to do when lockdown went into effect, convert his practice as much as possible to a telehealth model, which I wasn't aware could be done for brain or neuro rehab. But it's exciting to me because now it makes it more accessible to more people. So Titus, I'm excited to have you here to learn more about that and, hopefully get a few pearls for how to get my brain humming along on all cylinders.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so good to reconnect with you. Yeah, we had a great conversation last time, and I'm looking forward to today.
Let's give people just a real short synopsis of your background and what you do in the clinic, because some people may not know that there's this legitimate syndrome known as post-concussion syndrome, where people can be knocked out unconscious, or sometimes not even, I believe, knocked out fully unconscious, and they have these lingering symptoms afterwards. So kind of give us the quick primer for those who missed the first conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Dr. Titus Chu, functional neurologist, #1 bestselling author, and I specialize in helping high achievers go from thriving to surviving after concussion. And my whole journey began over 20 years ago when I was in a really bad car accident that almost took my life. And I tried everything within conventional medicine to fix my brain. And I was shocked that there really wasn't anything out there. So I went outside the box and I went back to school. I got a postdoc in clinical neurology, a master's in nutrition. I studied chiropractic, acupuncture, and everything I could get my hands on to figure out what was going on with my brain, and also take that information and share it with my patients. So, but yeah, like you said, when it comes to post-concussion syndrome and concussions in general, the interesting thing is you don't even need a physical trauma to your brain to experience a concussion. You can, or rather to your head. You definitely need a trauma to your brain to have a concussion, but you don't actually need to be hit on the head. Like I've had patients who, after riding in a roller coaster, like a strong jostling, or maybe even in a car accident, if they had a whiplash and they didn't even hit their head, develop concussion symptoms after that. So that's one of the most surprising things I discovered in my journey. You actually don't even need to hit your head to develop concussion and concussion symptoms.
Sorry. Let me plant a flag there just for 1 second. Are there a couple key questions that you ask? Because I'm always trying to refine our paperwork so that even before we see a patient, we have sleep disordered breathing as a potential item with a certain degree of confidence we associate to it based upon their history and the questions that we strategically ask in the paperwork. Are there, a few that are important as kind of early phase general screening questions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the most obvious is in our intake process, we just have a space where have you had a history of a concussion, or like injuries or trauma? So from there, typically, if I see something like whiplash, that's one thing I'll definitely explore. But and that's the surprising thing, it's like even minor injuries. I've had patients who, they fall off their bicycle, they don't land on their head, maybe they land on their wrist, but the whole force from that then creates this concussion profile in their nervous system. So that, yeah, to answer your question, the most
it's a pretty straightforward question.
Do you have a history of concussion or head injury? And then in addition to that, then it's like, do you have a history of trauma or injuries? And then from there, when I get on that first consult with them, when I'm talking to them, I ask them, I explore those things, especially if they don't know. And that's the thing, I've worked with a lot of patients, and just by the nature of my specialty, most patients and clients who reach out to me, they know that they had a concussion and that all their symptoms began afterwards. But I would have to say, before I began to explore that whole realm and specialize in concussion, like years ago, when I was just seeing more neurological conditions in general, that would be one of the things that I would begin to explore in greater detail. I'd be like, well, are you sure you didn't have a concussion? Did you even have a whiplash? And then a lot of times, my patients will then, it'll like jog their memory. Like, actually, yeah, around the time that I started to have that IBS and the brain fog, I got in a really bad car accident. I didn't lose consciousness or hit my head, but, so that those are the things that I start with. And then obviously, as I really explore their history in great detail to get to the root cause for their symptoms.
Sure. Okay, good. So that's good for me to know, because we have essentially a question that states, has there been any head injury, trauma, plus or minus concussion, as one question. And then to your recollection, did any of your symptoms start, around that time? Just so we have these pre-screenings. And again, for our audience at the clinic, we're really trying to make sure that there's the minimal amount of information that has to be vectored at your visit with your doctor, because I've found that people often forget stuff if you're doing it right there on the spot. So if you give them a chance to really sit alone and think through it, and then we try to refine the narrative when we have a chance to speak with them. So good. That's really helpful to we're not missing anything there.
Totally. And to add to that, you could have something like your intake form says, have you had a history of concussion? And then the next box would be, are you sure? Have a question mark. Because that's usually how the history process goes.
You jog them.
The first interview is like really exploring that. But like I said, most patients who reach out, they already know. They're like, yeah, after that car accident, I hit my head, or after that sports injury, that's when I developed the light sensitivity and the anxiety and the brain fog. So it's pretty straightforward. But before, like I said, when I began to explore this whole, I think, hidden epidemic of concussion, I'd really explore that with my patients to really make sure that that wasn't a contributing factor.
Sure. And just to kind of testify to this, and I have to kind of credit the late Dr. John D'Onofrio, who was formerly the head of the Chiropractic Board of Neurology, for opening my eyes to this. Because when I was early in my career, I lectured with him at a few spots across the country with his seminar series that he did. And I would just watch him would do what almost seemed like magic, where and I've told the story in the podcast before, so sorry for those who've already heard it, but he'd take someone who had vertigo and couldn't stand with their feet together, close their eyes, and then not fall over, and do an assessment and teach the audience, okay, this is indicating a misfiring in this region of the brain. And if we adjust here and use laser simulation there, we should be able to rectify that. And 3 minutes later, the person is able to stand up straight and not fall over.
Yeah.
And I saw this done again and again.
That stuff I see so often in my practice, both like we were talking about in person, but also virtually, like just doing these little challenges, these little therapeutic trials. And sometimes, bam, you see changes immediately. And it's not like 100% all the time. It's not like you do something and they're cured or they're healed completely, but it gives us clues as clinicians that we're moving in the right direction. And through the miracle neuroplasticity, when we continue with those different things, whether it's a certain eye movement or a special movement of their body, or maybe listening to specific tones in their ear, once those things like give us an improvement in the nervous system, and we can see that through objective testing, then we know we're moving in the right direction, and we just continue from there. It's actually a really exciting investigative process for me as a clinician.
Sure. And it's similar to what we do at the center, in regards to what is going to be the main factor or factors that move the gut in the right direction. Will it be more carbs, less carbs, more fermentation, less fermentation, dysbiotic treatments, anti-inflammatory treatments, and you really use people's feedback, the response, to steer. So I think we're similar in how we kind of work through this in this cascading decision trees or algorithm, that the patient's feedback is crucial to steering. It's kind of
it's completely data driven. Obviously too, there's the human experience when you talk to your patients, really understand bigger picture of what's going on with them, but it's cool that we can correlate, right, the data with their symptoms, and then therefore the data with their improvements in their symptoms.
Yeah,
it's
and that's how the
process.
data is useful, in my opinion. If it's just treating numbers, that's where I think a lot of the functional medicine field is going awry. It's a test forward and a data forward model, and they're actually putting the subjective experience of the patients in the back seat, and that should actually be what's forward. It should be a treatment and response forward algorithm, and the data are kind of woven into that. And yeah, that's where I think we really see eye to eye.
Absolutely.
Hey everyone, I have a treat for you. Are you on a low FODMAP diet or thinking about starting a low FODMAP diet? Well, if you are, I'd like to tell you about Modify Health. Modify Health is the first Monash University, who does all the FODMAP research, low FODMAP meal delivery company in the US, which ships also to all 50 states. All meals are fresh, fully prepared, tasty, low FODMAP, gluten-free, simply heat and eat. And Modify Health also has optional dietitian support if you have kind of advanced needs. So definitely check them out, and you can get 25% off your first week of low FODMAP meals and free shipping with code RUSCIO25, that's RUSCIO 25, when you visit modifyhealth.com. Now, we do want to come to some of these, tests that people can do virtually and such. But before we do that, you had made a remark that I wanted to open up for people, because I think this will land for a lot of our audience, which is sensitive people and the brain. We have people in our audience who might be sensitive to foods, to supplements, to the environment, maybe some people who have had or suspect mold exposure. And we've discussed how something, as an example, as limbic retraining therapy can really help to attenuate some of the reactivity in those cases. But there's another element to this, which I'd love for you to kind of give your perspective on how we should be thinking about the brain in sensitive patients, and what your type of therapeutic interventions may offer this cohort.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting because prior to my whole exploration into post-concussion syndrome, I worked with a lot of patients who had autoimmunity. And in general, I find patients who have autoimmunity were sensitive just kind of by nature, so to speak, And so the fascinating thing was I worked with these patients who are quote unquote sensitive. And then I started discovering these other group of patients who had had these symptoms that the typical protocols that I do wouldn't really move the needle. And when I explored in greater depth their history, like I said earlier in this conversation, I discovered that a huge group of them had a history of some type of concussion. And so from there, it was interesting because many of these people, not all of them, like of the concussion patients I work with, majority of them were not sensitive. Like prior to their concussion, they were just normal people. They can go about eating whatever foods, they could be exposed to chemicals and not fall apart, right? So it was really fascinating because I discovered that, on one hand, a lot of my autoimmune patients, they were just sensitive, or at least, highly sensitive people, versus my concussion patients, they developed sensitivity after their head injury or their concussion, like we said. And so it really made me ask the question, well, what's going on here? And so one of the biggest things, we can unpack this on so many levels, but as you probably know, after a concussion, especially if it's strong enough, a person can develop a breach of their blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is this protective structure, the single cell layer that protects your nervous system from the outside world. And I discovered, like, across the board, and you can actually do tests, as you know, for the blood-brain barrier, like integrity. I discovered that a lot of people who developed sensitivities after their concussion, they had a breach of the blood-brain barrier. So there was this physical trauma that happened after the concussion or the head injury. But then from there, it triggered in the research, we call it the second hit, where you have this physical trauma, and it creates inflammation in the nervous system and maybe a breach of the blood-brain barrier. Then it triggers a systemic inflammatory response that might impact the gut, for example. And then from there, the gut, as you know, launches a massive systemic inflammatory response that could then either release cytokines into the central nervous system or trigger a leaky brain, the blood-brain barrier permeability, and then get in, leading to that second hit. So, and that's what I find is one of the biggest root causes for sensitivity after a concussion. There's other things as well, and from there, as you know, that leads a whole neuroinflammatory cascade and the activation of microglia cells and all those different things that happens from a neurochemical perspective. So that's one of the things I see happen in the brain after a concussion is breach of the blood-brain barrier leading to sensitivity. But in addition to that, the physical trauma could impact the different neural networks that make up our nervous system that give us the ability to do things like balance or coordinate or have clear thoughts and be focused. So if there's actually injury to the physical structures of the brain, then the symptoms and the sensitivity are very specific to different types of triggers. As an example, on the one hand, if it's someone who's developed sensitivity because they have a breach of the blood-brain barrier, typically anything will trigger their symptoms, right? They're just inflamed, their nervous system. And then they experience things like brain fatigue or brain fog and, what's known as sickness behavior syndrome, where they just feel so unmotivated and don't want to get out of bed. And a lot of them experience depression, right? So that's the neuroinflammatory trigger for sensitivity. Whereas the other one, when I was describing like the physical reasons, like if you have a injury to physical structures of the brain and it's not just an inflammatory response, then I find it's typically people become sensitive, but to only very specific triggers. So as an example, there's a area of the nervous system. Yeah, we actually talked about this in our last podcast called the vestibular system that gives us the ability to perceive where our head is in space. So it's like proprioception and body awareness. So I find if there's injury to that specific neural network, the triggers then will be specific to the vestibular system, meaning maybe if they are in a car or if they move really fast, they move their head really quickly, those are the triggers that then lead to sensitivity. So they become very sensitive in this one particular area. So then it's, for me as a functionalist, it's like, I can have a conversation with someone in like 5-10 minutes. I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the neural network. Here's the root cause, right? Whereas again, the first profile, kind of like the neuroinflammatory patient. And by the way, as you know, when I describe this, it doesn't even have to be after a concussion, right? A person could develop neuroinflammation from exposure to chemical toxins, to food sensitivities, to even emotional stress or things like hypoxia. But that's besides the point. So like I was saying, so for the neuroinflammatory patient, they become sensitive because of a breach of the blood-brain barrier. And we know that, right, is because they're sensitive to almost anything coming in, any sensory signals like lights or sounds or movements, as well as cognitive, like if they have to think about things. Many of the patients, especially if it's really severe, they just don't want to get out of bed and they end up feeling depressed and what we call sickness behavior syndrome. Whereas the other hand, after a trauma, you can actually have injury to specific regions, and that's more physical structures of the brain, but then it's specific to what's actually happening. My point is it's really important to, for different patients out there who are struggling with symptoms, you have to figure out what the root cause is for their sensitivity. Number one, is it just they're sensitive by nature? Like, again, a lot of the autoimmune patients I work with, they're just born sensitive, to all different types of things, whether mental or emotional. Or was it after a concussion? And usually if it develops after a concussion, it's either number one, there's the neuroinflammation going on because of breach of the blood-brain barrier, or number two, there's specific injury to regions of the nervous system. And you can actually have a combination of both those scenarios. But at the end of the day, once you can get to the root cause for that particular person, like what's going on in their nervous system, then you can devise and put together a plan that actually strengthens those areas and helps shift those microglia cells back from this inflammatory state to one of healing, like the healing response. And there's a bunch of different natural ways that we can do that, obviously through diet, supplements, lifestyle changes, as well as brain training exercises.
Well, a lot there to unpack. One and respond to, and I love it. One thing I think that really is worth echoing is your comment about some people might be more sensitive than others, and I think that's important because I'm becoming, I'm sure our audience knows, increasingly concerned that with the test and diagnosis heavy nature of functional medicine, we are inadvertently, I think we're all trying to help people, yes, but we're inadvertently pathologizing things that to a large extent are normal. Small perturbations in hormones or vitamin levels. And it's, you've got this or that syndrome. Or if you don't, let's say you are a little bit constitutionally, environmentally sensitive. Well, now you're labeled with MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. And what we're doing at the center now is we're really converting our language to non-pathological language. As just one example, yes, thank you. So as to reduce the psychological burden of patients, we're no longer using the acronyms MCAS, and we're saying, you might be a little bit histamine intolerant. And we're not using the term mycotoxicity. We're just saying mold, because we're not trying to further ingrain in people this pathological sickness. There's something wrong with me, because some of these things are just you're normal, and we're all operating at different normals, right? Some people are fast, some people are slow, some people are tall, some people are short, some people have skin that won't burn, some people have skin that will burn, and we're trying not to feed into those differences as being a thing, a condition, a syndrome, a what have you, and frame them as, okay, you're a strong person who can and will be healthy. There's just this little monkey wrench in the system. We're going to try to take care of that, and we anticipate you're going to be just fine. Yeah, so I love that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's so much unpack there, right? The whole psychoneuroimmunology component of healing that's really, obviously I think in conventional medicine is really not acknowledged, right? That's why you have the placebo-controlled trials, but sometimes the power of the mind has the ability to impact health or disease, right?
Great point.
So I think that's so important, the whole mindset piece and languaging. And that's why, it's like when I work with patients and clients, I will use data, I will run labs, but then it's like, well, what's healthy and normal for them? And again, going back to like those two sets of patients that I would work with throughout the years, especially the concussion patients, it's like, well, what they're experiencing now is definitely not what they were prior to the concussion. So I'm always trying to not so much compare them. Obviously, there's, as you know, with data and lab values, there's like what's optimal and what's within range, and you got to look at that. But at the same time, I put that in the context of like, well, what's normal for this person, right? And for me, when I work with patients who have concussion, it's pretty black and white. It's like, well, they were healthy or relatively healthy, or at least adapting, right? And then after their concussion, they weren't. So that to me is like, it's easier to see that. Whereas but for patients who are or people who are sensitive in general, like typically patients who develop autoimmunity, like then it's kind of harder to tease that apart. But what I've found across the board, regardless if they're sensitive to begin with, just by nature, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Or if they're sensitive after a trauma, I found that the approach to a sensitive patient is completely different than it is for the majority of other people out there, right? It's like you might have the same exact supplements or diet, but I learned over the years working with a lot of sensitive patients, the way you actually communicate, like what you're saying, but also how you recommend they take it, right? Like rather
slow and
for
steady
example,
and simple.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, like a real world example is I might have a supplement protocol that I recommend for a patient, but I'll be like, okay, start with this one first, see how you feel, right? And then take that for 2 or 3 days. If you feel okay, then start the next one. Where I know I'll be the first to admit I made this mistake in the past where I just give a person everything. Here's the whole supplement protocol. Here's the diet. Here's everything. And they would try and they'd get so overwhelmed because again, they were sensitive.
Yeah.
And I actually see when a lot of patients I work with these days, as an example, when I work with patients, obviously with concussion, one thing I see, one mistake I see like therapists and clinicians make, especially with like rehab, is they overdo it. And so, for example, I have this one patient, I'll just say more like a general patient, like profile, so to speak. Like patients I've worked with, a lot of patients they develop symptoms after concussion, right? But then on top of that, when I do a workup, I either find out that they have autoimmunity by taking the history, obviously, or through testing, we discover together that they have autoimmunity. My point in saying this, a lot of patients who I've worked with who have both concussion as well as something else going on, right, besides the concussion, the type of rehab they need, it might be the same exact exercise, like eye movement exercise or head movement, but the intensity has to be totally taken into account for them. I see so many therapists, like, again, they're trained to the best of their ability. They understand maybe vestibular rehab or eye exercise or vision therapy, but many times they might not understand how that needs to fit in for a person who's more sensitive. Let's say someone who's had who has autoimmunity. So one of the biggest things I see is clinicians giving too much of a therapy too fast. It's kind of like that idea, just push through it, fight through it, and you'll be fine. And I find that
fully agreed.
Sensitive patients, like that is the worst way to approach it. It's like you take 3 steps forward and then you have like 10 steps back.
Yeah. Well, this is why I appreciate your perspective, because this is one of a tenured clinician, who, just like me, started off with all the theory and probably a degree of dogma that accompanies any field. And it's a kind of testing heavy, treatment heavy scenario. And at least we've learned our way out of it. The providers for whom I hope we can shed some light on is the ones who think, like you said, you have to work through it. And well, you may feel bad for 3 months before you feel better. I haven't found that really to be true for anyone. It's usually too aggressive, or they're reacting, or what have you. And I don't want to derail this topic, but I did hear you say something from the last few comments that I wanted to circle back to. And that is, could a vestibular, let's say lesion of some sort, do you see that parallel with exercise intolerance? Because at the center, we see some patients who don't have a high tolerance for exercise. And I'm wondering if that could be more movement than their vestibular system could handle. I mean, I'm assuming that would present with dizziness and nausea, as opposed to someone who just says, well, I'm just tired. And it's more of like a chronic fatigue crash than it is vestibular. But, is there any parsing of those two entities that you might be able to, color in for us?
Absolutely. Yeah. I see this all the time. And the top 3 things that come to mind when you talk about exercise intolerance is, number 1, gluten sensitivity, number 2, dysautonomia, and then finally, number 3, vestibular issues. But the fastest way when for example, if I'm taking a history with a patient, if they describe exercise intolerance, by the way, also obviously mitochondrial issues, but the fastest way I parse through it is I figure out what type of exercise they're intolerant to. So if they say something like, when I go for a hike, like in the terrain is like really windy, I feel terrible. Or if I go for walks, I feel okay, but then after about 10 minutes, I don't feel well. And especially if I go jogging, I feel terrible. So then I'll ask them, well, have you ever tried sitting on a stationary bike and exercising? Like, when I do it, when I'm on a stationary bike, I feel fine. Right there, then I know one of the biggest root causes for their exercise intolerance is probably vestibular. Because when you're sitting on a stationary bike, you're not bringing the vestibular system into play. And what I mean by that, the vestibular system perceives movement of your head. So if someone's going for a walk, or if someone's going for a jog or a hike, they're moving their body and they're moving their head around. And one of the jobs of the vestibular system is every movement of the head, there's a specific eye movement reflex that happens so you can maintain your vision and not have blurriness or nausea when you're walking. And also there's another reflex that by way of what we call the vestibulospinal tract that connects your inner ear, your vestibular system, to your spinal stabilizing muscles. So when you're moving, if your vestibular system is working well, your eyes will move accordingly and your muscles will fire accordingly so you don't lose your balance. And so if there's an issue with the vestibular system, when there's any type of challenge, meaning like, if someone's even just walking or moving their head quickly or in a car or going on a hike, and they develop symptoms and quote unquote exercise intolerance, but they don't when they're sitting on a stationary bike because their head's not really moving, then I know without a doubt, or like 99% sure, that when I do testing, then I'm going to explore the vestibular system. Whereas if a patient's like, I feel terrible no matter what I do, if I've been on a stationary bike or on a treadmill, if I go for a walk, or anytime I exercise and my heart rate goes up, so if it's like all exercises, then I'm looking at something, like either gluten sensitivity, dysautonomia, or mitochondrial issues.
And this concept of dysautonomia is also one I wanted to circle over to. And D'Onofrio would describe this as a cortical hemisphericity, meaning that you have your left hemisphere of your brain and your right hemisphere of your brain. And if they have equal strength or equal kind of firing amplitude, they'll inhibit sympathetics and they'll allow this kind of sympathetic vagal tone to be where it should be. And I know that was a bit of a simplified heuristic to help people kind of wrap their minds around it. Mm-hmm. But I'm just wondering with dysautonomia, meaning an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. Are you finding that there's a hemisphericity, a brain hemisphere imbalance, and a kind of vagal nerve tie-in? And for our audience, the vagal nerve is kind of what regulates or helps to regulate the parasympathetic rest, digest, relax. Are all these interlinked? Is this common, or is it maybe not as easy as the hemisphericity model would suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. The hemisphericity model, looking at the balance between the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain, is a great starting point. But what I've discovered, and especially, you can have dysautonomia due to a lot of reasons, but if it is truly just a neurological root cause, there's so many other areas of the nervous system that impact autonomic function, right? So there's obviously the hemispheres, like the prefrontal cortex, especially, and the hippocampus, and you can have left and right imbalances. But then even going back to what we're talking about with the vestibular system has a powerful connection with the autonomic nervous system, right? And so things like vestibular imbalances could also lead to dysautonomia. I found brainstem definitely, because the brainstem's kind of like the closest link between your nervous system and regulation of your body and the autonomic functions like heart rate and digestive function, etc. So there's multiple areas of the nervous system that can trigger dysautonomia. In terms of concussion, I find that the most common ones are typically actually the inner ear and the brainstem, and not so much the higher centers of the brain, like the hemispheres, so to speak, like the neocortex. But again, that's the most of the patients I work with have concussions, and the inner ear is very easily susceptible to trauma after a head injury, right? But yeah, definitely, part of that whole neurological stress response. And what I mean by that is, right, we have the HPA axis, which is the neuroendocrine stress response. But then you have a neurological stress response that, you have, just like, there's this massive fiber of neurons that connect your prefrontal cortex with your brainstem. So you can have problems with the stress response that have nothing to do with your adrenal glands, or maybe very little to do, and actually is more neurologically rooted because of issues with
blasphemy.
Yeah,
blasphemy.
No, I mean, if you look at the research, what sits at the top of the HPA axis? It's the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, right? So, and that's the thing, it's just physiology. There's neurological stress reactions, but then there's also endocrine by way of the humoral system, right? Through chemicals like hormones and neurotransmitters that's carried through blood pathways. But then you also have these neural pathways that they don't travel through the bloodstream. Like there's a specific nerve pathways that we describe, right? And I mean, the best one that everyone knows about these days is the vagus nerve, like the brainstem. So there's within the brainstem, you have three parts of it. You have the midbrain at the top, the pons, and the medulla at the bottom, right? So top, middle, and bottom. And at the junction of the middle and bottom, what we call the pontomedullary junction, is where you house the actual nucleus, the cells that make up the vagus nerve. So it's like you have these brain cells or these neurons in your brainstem at the lower part of it that then send a signal by way of the vagus nerve to all the different body regions that create the autonomic responses. That's not by way of the adrenal glands, right? That's not activated. Right. I mean, it could be influenced by things like cortisol and norepinephrine, but that's an electrochemical pathway versus just a humoral endocrine pathway. Anyways, like we're totally nerding out here. My point is answering your question. Yeah. Over the years, I've found that the hemisphere model, looking at the brain and left brain versus right brain, it's a great starting point. But then there's so many other regions of the nervous system. And depending on what functions we're talking about, if we're talking about autonomic functions, there's specific neural networks that are associated with autonomic function that go beyond just the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex.
Right. Well, I have a similar potential oversimplification that I'm wondering if this irritates you. I could probably think of a whole myriad of these canards that frustrate me with my specialty of gut health. But people thinking that the way to improve their sympathetic balance or their autonomic function is just do gagging exercises 2 times a day, and that's going to fix everything. Is one of these I fear oversimplifications that are floating around out there. Now, it's not also to say that I suspect this is overly daunting to assess and get right, but I think people listen to a podcast or read a blog, they take away one kind of side comment from a clinician. Then before you know it, I have patients who are, all gagging themselves coming in and saying, well, I've been gagging myself for 2 months. I don't know why my SIBO and IBS hasn't gone away. Is that a fair criticism? Is that something that frustrates you?
Yeah. It's I mean, there's several ways of looking at it. I think it's great that information is available. And sometimes those little tips here and there can change a person's life, right? So on that note, I think it can be positive, but obviously it's not as simple as that. It's just like if someone to say, yeah, the miracle for everyone for whatever health issue, whatever you're struggling with, is vitamin D. It has to be personalized, and there's so much more to that. And we discussed that in great detail in the last podcast, but really, at the end of the day, it needs to be personalized. So if someone out there tries something like gargling because they think it'll activate their vagus nerve and it helps them, that's awesome, right? But if they do it and it doesn't help, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need to activate their vagus nerve. It might not be the right specific pathway because there's multiple ways of activating the vagus nerve that travels along different neural networks, meaning it has to be personalized to each person. But also the intensity of it, right? We talked about last time how we can use electroceuticals to activate the vagus nerve. There's even surgical implants you can use to activate the vagus nerve. So just because gargling didn't help doesn't, number one, mean that it's not the right thing they need to do. Maybe it's just the wrong intensity, or there's other ways of activating the vagus nerve. I mean, one of the most common ones I see for a lot of patients of mine who have digestive symptoms, one of the best ways of activating the vagus nerve, if they're not doing it already, is chewing their food. Like when you chew your food down and you actually chew it to the level where it's almost like water, like a liquid. Number one, you're helping to you're masticating and breaking it down. So then your stomach doesn't have to do too much peristalsis when it's down there. But then number two, there's a specific nerve reflex between the TMJ, your jaw, like the trigeminal nerve, and your vagus nerve. So when you actually chew your food, just the physical action of doing that triggers the vagus nerve, but specific to digestive function, right? So gargling might not help, but maybe chewing their food, right? As an example. There's also ways of activating the vagus nerve by way of like other pathways related to the eyes and the nose, or not the nose, but the eyes, as well as the inner ear. And I think we talked about last time too, like visceral manipulation or belly massages. There's these pathways. So it really, when we talk about the vagus nerve, it's kind of a hot topic these days, but you want to be really clear as to what we're actually trying to accomplish there. What is right for this person, right? Because you can activate the vagus nerve by way of the vestibular pathways or by way of these visceral pathways, these somatic reflexes, right? And it has to be personalized to the patient.
Yeah, well, that's good to know, and it affirms my suspicion. And also, great comment that those tidbits, when they land for someone, are really helpful and can sometimes be life changing. So, yeah, I should definitely acknowledge that. Hi guys, cognition is one of my most valued assets, and interestingly, the Framingham Offspring Cohort Study did find dietary choline intake correlated with better cognitive performance. Similarly, a supplemental trial in the Journal of Clinical Neuropharmacology found the same. In light of this, I've recently been experimenting with a choline complex supplement from Body Bio, and I am feeling a bit sharper. If you'd like to try a half teaspoon per day, as I am, visit bodybio.com, purchase their Body Bio PC for phosphatidylcholine complex, and use Ruscio20 at checkout for 20% off. What about a vagal nerve stimulator? I have here a Zen unit, or aka a Nuvana unit, and I've just started kind of tinkering with it. I guess they have an updated model they sent me with more user-friendly instructions. And I'm wondering, is that something that you've experimented with? Do you have any recommendations for how someone may want to consider using one of these? And for our audience, essentially, it looks like a little, almost like a cell phone-like device with headphones, and the headphones kind of buzz and pulse. And apparently, this this offers a degree of vagal nerve stimulation. I did do a brief research query on the use of these, and it seems that they can help with, it was either depression or anxiety, but I saw some other studies that they may actually worsen sleep apnea, or I'm not sure if it was apnea specifically or just insomnia. This is a quick poke in the PubMed, so take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, wondering what your thoughts are on these kind of direct-to-consumer VNS units.
Yeah, there's a lot out there because as we know, the vagus nerve is a really hot topic these days, especially in like the biohacker world, but also, in functional medicine and functional neurology. And so there's a lot of devices out there. I don't have experience with that one in particular, but I've experienced with other ones that, if it's right for the person, it can be a game changer, resetting the nervous system. And that's the thing. It's, I'd be curious to look into this actual device you're talking about, because it's interesting, because there's a lot, especially on the market these days, because it is such a hot topic, that there's a lot of these claims that it's a vagus nerve stimulator. But I'd be curious to see the research. How do they come to that conclusion? Like, how are they actually activating the vagus nerve? Like, because there's a lot of different ones out there. There's ones that like vibrate the wrist, and they say it activates the vagus nerve, but I actually don't know any pathway that.
That's the I think the Apollo Neuro. I did some experimentation.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have a lot of great feedback. I hear great feedback from people who use that. I'm just saying that,
but it could also be placebo. So yeah, there's always that skeptical nature of, and you know what? If it's I forget how much the device costs, but I think it's a couple $100. If that gives someone a sense of protection or benefiting their health, and that shows up in a measurable way, even if it is placebo, I'm not fully opposed to it, but I think we're both a tad skeptical. So it's like, what kind of evidence?
Yeah. And I mean, actually, I'm not so much talking about placebo. Like, placebo, I think, is always involved in any type of intervention, like if you're right, for the most part. But that being said, I'm just talking about the actual physiology. So I mean, we can like go off on this idea of placebo. I've thought about it a lot, but for example, like acupuncture. Like if you do acupuncture, there's going to be a placebo component, but there's also the physiological responses that sticking a needle into someone will trigger in a person's nervous system. So that's what I mean by that. It's like, I'm curious how these companies say like it activates the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve, like I said, it's a very specific nerve from the bottom part of your brainstem that goes to different organs, like the dilator muscles of your pupils, for example. It creates actually constrictors. It creates that. That's the parasympathetic.
Maybe they're making a little bit of an inferential jump to my understanding, and you know way more about this than I do, but the extremities mechanoreceptors are afferent to the parasympathetic, and maybe they're making this claim of
that's a jump. That's what I mean. It's like, and even for example, what I said with the pupil constrictors, that's a different nerve pathway, but the vagus nerve, it goes and communicates between your nervous system and all these different organs and blood vessels and glands and things like that. So if you're, anyways, I'm kind of like,
we're nerding
really
out, but
but again, if it works, there's a physiological reason for that too. Because if there's a little vibration, that does trigger a nerve response. And then depending on the technology and like neurofeedback processes,
right.
Another really great one out there too is like heart math, right? They talk about heart math, and it's pretty much like a neurofeedback device. You synchronize your breathing with images, and you can actually see measurable changes in your heart rate variability. And from there, they're saying, okay, that's one of the functions of the vagus nerve, is to impact heart rate variability. But anyways, I'm just kind of nitpicking it. At the end of the day, I think a lot of these devices, right, if it's targeting the right neural network for that person, it could be a game changer. Like there's different electroceutical devices that I use in my practice, but a lot of times the way I'll come up with which device to recommend will be through a history and then the neurological exam, because then from there I could identify the weak link in their nervous system and the specific pathway that we want to activate. Do I want to, use something like the Apollo? Do I want to use something like HeartMath? Do I want to use something like these bone conducting headphones? Or do I just want to have the person chew their food more, right? It's all revealed in that whole process, the investigative process.
And I want to jump there after this question, which would be for someone in a boat like my own, which is feeling pretty darn great and mostly concerned with better output, better energy, better performance. And I would say just overall under this moniker of performance optimization.
Yeah.
Is this something that the assessment also works to find? I'm assuming something like more of a subtle imbalance that might give you a 10% gain. Like, is there some benefit there to be had?
Oh yeah. Over the years, and it's really part of my whole journey, I made this discovery, and it's not even my discovery, but it's like I embodied it, is the miracle of neuroplasticity. Once you identify the area of the nervous system that's the weak link, and then you give specific exercises or neuroplastic therapies to strengthen those areas, not only can you help people recover from things like concussion or anxiety or depression, you can also take the same exact principles of neuroplasticity and take someone who's like healthy and take their brain to the next level. And like I said, I went through that whole process myself. It was like after my car accident, the car accident that was 20 years ago, I developed these concussion symptoms and my life fell apart for quite some time. So I had to really rebuild my brain from the ground up. But once I got healthy again, I would take the same exact principles that I learned and realize that I can apply it and take my life to a whole new level. It's like in many ways, not all, but in many ways, I actually see that I'm healthier and my nervous system's it's like stronger, more resilient, and functions at a higher level than maybe when I was 18, when I was inflamed and had all these health issues, even before my concussion,
Sure.
So yeah, you can definitely, the key again, like in your question, is like, you can try like a blanket approach, like, oh, I heard this guy say if you gargle or if you spin in a chair, your brain will work better. It's like you can take that approach, but if you really want to get like personalized and get faster results, then the assessment process is so invaluable, regardless if you're trying to recover from a concussion or you just want to hack your nervous system and get better at whatever is important to you, whether it's thinking, whether it's athletic performance, even like emotional resilience, right? And emotional intelligence, EQ, so to speak. So that's the beauty of neuroplasticity. I've discovered it's the same principles, whether you're trying to heal from something or you're trying to take your life to the next level. And with a thorough evaluation, you can really figure out what's the weak links, in my nervous system and what are the right exercises that I can use to strengthen my brain. It's the same thing with functional medicine, right? You can get
same thing with the gut, especially. I do the same sort of thing in the clinic.
Sometimes you just only testing will reveal these things. Like how I don't know if a person has breach of the blood-brain barrier. There's clues that might be in the history, but without objective testing, then it's like, then we can really see it black and white, and then from there, track progress as an example. But yeah, so but that's the thing, even in an assessment process, there's different levels of that. I kind of like the analogy, even before, if anyone's interested in working with me, if they've had a concussion, even before I talk to them or like learn anything about them, I already have like a 5,000 foot view of what's going on just because there's patterns, right? And then when I have a conversation or they fill out some intake forms, then I have like a 500 foot view. And then when I actually do a history and talk to them in great detail, then it's like up close, right? Up and personal view. And then when we do testing, like neurological testing or lab testing, then we actually have this like chemical view, chemical level view, like cellular level of what's happening. And every step of the way, when I gather more information, then I could put together a plan that really accelerates their healing process or helps them reach their health goals a lot faster.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Ruscio. In case you need help, I wanted to quickly make you aware of what resources are available to you. If you go to drruscio.com/resources, you will see a few links you can click through for more. Firstly, there is the clinic, which I'm immensely proud of the fact that we deliver cost-effective, simple, but highly efficacious functional medicine. There's also my book, Healthy Good, Healthy You, which has been proven to allow those who've been unable to improve their health, even after seeing numerous doctors, to be able to help them finally feel better. There's also our store, where there's a number of products like our Elemental Heal line, our probiotic line, and other gut supportive and health supportive supplements. Health coaching. We now offer health coaching. So if you've read the book or listened to a podcast like this one, or are reading about a product and you need some help with how or when to use or how to integrate with diet, we now offer health coaching to help you along your way. And then finally, if you're a clinician, there is our clinician's newsletter, The Future of Functional Medicine Review, which I'm very proud to say we've now had doctors who've read that newsletter find challenging cases in their practices, apply what we teach in the newsletter, and be able to help these patients who were otherwise considered challenging cases. Everything for these resources can be accessed through drruscio.com/resources. Alrighty, back to the show. Let's discuss how you've converted some of these assessments to be, able to be conducted in a predominantly telehealth climate. Because I'm curious about, some of this seems like it makes a lot of sense, but just for my own edification, I'm sure the audience is also, wondering, if I wanted to do this, what does a telehealth visit look like with something that you would have thought may have really required an in-person presence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure too, it's like as a clinician, I've learned over the years that the number one best assessment tool I have is a conversation with the person, right? The history. So right there, so much can be revealed. And the cool thing is there's a lot of technologies, like I use different softwares that can actually measure brain function. Like I use this one that measures vision as well as cognitive function and balance, like 3 core areas of brain function. And it's a computerized system that we can get objective data looking at reaction time and balance and eye movement tracking. And those are really important because those are windows into these different neural networks that I was describing earlier, like looking at visual neural networks related to eye movements, what we call the oculomotor system. So if a person doesn't score high in that test, then I have an idea that when we discuss like a plan moving forwards, we're going to do things that retrain their eye movements. If they have issues that are mainly cognitive that the testing can reveal, then we can do things that are more related to cognitive training. And obviously with balance, then we do things related to balance, strengthening balance. So part of that whole process is, again, it's the same thing I do in office. We get intake forms. I'll review a person's history beforehand. And even then, I'll have a really good idea of which direction to go. Then I have a video consultation with them and I explore their history in greater detail, figuring out what are their triggers, what are the things that help them. And those are huge clues because I understand the physiology underneath that points me to the root cause. And then from there, we can do this remote testing, like completely virtual. They actually do it in the comfort of their own home. They download a little app to their smartphone and they can perform these tests of vision, cognitive function, and balance. And then if I think it's necessary to go even further, I can actually do a lot of neurological testing via video consult. I can look at how a person balanced, their reaction time. I can even do some eye movement testing depending on how well the connection is and get a lot of information from there. And the whole purpose of that comprehensive process is to really get to the root cause. Like I'm always asking the question, why? Why does this person have these symptoms? Why do they have anxiety after their concussion? Why do they develop brain fog, brain fatigue, and headaches after being on the screen for 30 minutes? So through that whole process of the history, of the computerized brain function of brain testing, and then sometimes if needed, the virtual neurological testing, I have a great idea of what we need to do, right? And then in addition to that, obviously we can run the functional lab tests as needed, blood tests, urine tests, all of that can be done completely virtually. And the awesome thing is a lot of patients and clients I work with, we're able to work completely virtually, 100%. I give them an at-home brain training program to strengthen the areas of their nervous system that are the weak links. And based on, questionnaires as well as functional lab tests we might run, I could put together a plan looking at diet, supplements, and lifestyle, and they take off running. Sometimes we can even, depending on if I think they need the technologies, a lot of the technologies that we're talking about, like the one you mentioned earlier, and like the Apollo and the HeartMath, those you can, they can purchase on their own and then use them at home. So then I walk them through how it fits into their overall program. And that being said, I found that especially with everything shifting virtual since last year, like I found that a lot of it can be done completely virtually. And then for patients who I think need additional advanced neurological assessments, like there are things that I can, like they actually then come in office. They either will travel from parts of California or fly in to see me. I've had patients fly internationally, especially before everything, again, the lockdown and whatnot. And then I can do a really in-depth neurological exam for the patients who really need that extra TLC. And then we can use the more advanced treatment technologies like low-level laser or oxygen or infrared, things of that nature. But yeah, what I found in those whole process, a lot of it can, like the first foundational steps can be completely handled virtually. And then from there, some patients then would need like an in-person visit, but I found a lot of them actually don't.
And you established the precedent there based upon your book, which I can testify that I've simply had some patients just read your book and go through the exercises, and it's been notably helpful for them.
Yeah, exactly. It's like every step of the way. That's what I was saying earlier about that 10,000, 5,000, 500 foot view. It's like with the book, even if I've never met a person before, I've been through it myself. I healed my brain from a concussion. I've worked with thousands of patients over the years. So I know these patterns, and I developed that brain save approach, the step-by-step system. And it's cool because the more I do it and the more latest research comes out that I'm always looking into, I refine that, like brain save. I think I wrote that, 3 years ago now, 2018, I think. It's come even from then come a long way because I'm always refining it based on what's the latest, research out there and stuff that works for people.
Right. Well, will you remind people of your website, and wherever you'd want to point them online to connect with you, and also the book title and where they can pick that up?
Yeah, definitely. So my website's brainsave.com, and I actually have this quick PDF, a quick start guide to the vagus nerve, because we talked about like some exercises that you can do like at home, simple, low tech things. But in addition to that, I've laid out a few technologies that if people need a bigger dose to their vagus nerve, or at least triggering that parasympathetic response, there's some things as well on there. I'm pretty sure the direct link is brainsave.com/Vagus, VAGUS. But if you just go to brainsave.com, you'll be able to find it.
Awesome. All right, my man. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. You've definitely made it easier for me to refer for this when I see it flagged on my paperwork. And I'm probably going to do a virtual consult with you just to see if I have anything here that I can tune up, just because I would like to see if there's any kind of foil on my neurological aerodynamics. So expect to get an email from me. I'll try to be somewhat compliant.
Look forward to hearing from you. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you, sir. Again, I appreciate you coming on. And folks, if you resonated with any of this, it doesn't have to be a big laborious process. I think the book's a great first step. And then if you don't get to where you'd like to after the book, reach out directly and go through the virtual consult to make sure that your brain health is as tuned up as it can be. And Titus, thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the invite. It's great talking to you.
100%. Same.
Thank you for listening to Dr. Ruscio Radio today. Check us out on iTunes and leave a review. Visit drruscio.com to ask a question for an upcoming podcast, post comments for today's show, and sign up to receive weekly updates. That's drruscio.com.